This isn't your typical campfire storytelling session. These are horrifying tales from the wilderness that go beyond what you've ever heard before. Stories drenched in blood, desire, and the terror that comes from being truly alone in the dark. If you think camping is about bonding and peace, think again. By the end of this video, you'll never want to set foot in the woods again. Story number 1. The forest stretched endlessly before them, a sea of towering trees and dense underbrush that swallowed the fading sunlight. The 6 college friends, Emily, Tom, Lisa, Jake, Alex, and Sarah, had been planning this camping trip for weeks, eager to escape the monotony of campus life and the pressures of their final exams. But as they ventured deeper into the woods, the excitement of the trip began to give way to an uneasy tension. "Are we even on the right trail?" Alex asked, wiping sweat from his brow. His voice carried an edge of irritation as he adjusted his overloaded backpack. Emily, the self-proclaimed leader of the group and an experienced hiker, glanced down at the map in her hands. "Yes, we're on the right trail. It's just a little farther to the campsite." "A little farther?" Alex groaned, gesturing to the endless stretch of forest ahead. "Your definition of little needs work, Emily." "Stop whining," Lisa snapped, her blonde hair catching the golden rays of the setting sun as she trudged forward. "This was your idea in the first place, remember? Let's go camping. It'll be fun," she mimicked, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Yeah, well, I didn't think we'd be hiking for hours to get there," Alex retorted. "Guys, can we not?" Tom interjected, his voice calm but firm. He adjusted the straps of his backpack and glanced over at Emily, his girlfriend. "Let's just focus on getting to the site before it gets dark." Sarah lagged behind the group, her footsteps hesitant as she scanned the trees around them. The forest felt wrong. The air was too still, the shadows too deep, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Jake, walking beside her, noticed her unease. "You okay, Sarah?" he asked, his camera slung around his neck. Sarah hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, I'm fine. It's just, have you ever heard of the stories about these woods?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "What stories?" "The legends," Sarah said quietly, "about people disappearing out here. Hunters, hikers, even campers. They say something lives in these woods, something that takes people and skins them." Jake let out a nervous laugh. "Come on, Sarah. You've been listening to too many campfire tales. There's no such thing as skinning monsters." Sarah didn't respond, but the unease in her chest only grew as they pressed on. By the time they reached the clearing Emily had marked on the map, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The group set to work pitching their tents, the banter and laughter returning as they settled into the routine of setting up camp. "This isn't so bad," Lisa said as she hammered the last stake into the ground. "See, Alex? We made it." Alex rolled his eyes but smiled. Yeah, I guess it's not the worst." After a quick dinner of sandwiches and trail mix, Emily suggested exploring the area before it got too dark. "Let's split up," she said, pulling out a flashlight. "We can cover more ground that way." "Isn't that how horror movies start?" Jake joked, earning a chuckle from the group. "Relax," Emily said with a grin. "We're just looking around. Stick to the trails and we'll meet back here in an hour." Sarah's stomach twisted. "I don't think splitting up is a good idea," she said quickly. "Come on, Sarah," Alex teased. "What are you afraid of? The boogeyman?" "It's fine," Emily assured her. "We'll stay in pairs. Nothing's going to happen." Reluctantly, Sarah agreed, pairing up with Jake while the others formed their own groups. The discovery. Sarah and Jake wandered north, their flashlight beams cutting through the encroaching darkness. The forest seemed to close in around them, the towering trees casting long, skeletal shadows across the ground. "This place is kinda creepy at night," Jake admitted, his voice low. Sarah didn't reply, her attention focused on the faint rustling sounds that seemed to follow them. "Hey, check this out," Jake said suddenly, his flashlight illuminating a dark opening in the hillside. Sarah stopped short, her heart pounding as she stared at the gaping hole. "A cave?" "Yeah," Jake said, excitement creeping into his voice. "Let's check it out." Sarah hesitated. "I don't think that's a good idea." "Come on," Jake said, already stepping toward the entrance. "It's probably nothing. Maybe some cool rock formations or something." Against her better judgment, Sarah followed him into the cave, her flashlight trembling in her hands. The air grew colder as they ventured deeper, the faint smell of decay growing stronger with each step. Then, Jake's flashlight flickered over something that made them both freeze. Bones. Hundreds of them scattered across the cave floor. Skulls, rib cages, and femurs, all stripped clean and arranged in grotesque patterns. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake stumbled backward, his face pale. This can't be real." But it was the walls that truly made Sarah's stomach churn. Strips of bloody skin were nailed to the jagged stone, each piece stretched taut like a gruesome tapestry. "We need to leave," Sarah said urgently, grabbing Jake's arm. Before he could respond, a low guttural sound echoed from the darkness, a sound that sent ice down their spines. "Jake," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "Run." They turned and bolted, the flashlight beams bouncing wildly as they raced back toward the entrance. But as they ran, Sarah caught a glimpse of something in the corner of her eye. Something tall and hunched, with skin that seemed to glisten in the dim light. Something that was watching them. The forest was no longer just silent. It was suffocating. Every breath Sarah took felt heavy, as though the air itself was closing in on her. She clung to Jake's arm as they stumbled deeper into the woods, their flashlights barely piercing the dense darkness. "Emily? Alex? Lisa?" Jake's voice cracked as he shouted again, his throat raw. The tapping sound had stopped, leaving an eerie stillness that was somehow worse. It felt as though the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. "We're going in circles," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm sure we've passed that tree before." Jake swung his flashlight in frustration, illuminating the gnarled trunk of a tree marked with deep, claw-like scratches. She was right. It was the same tree they'd passed 20 minutes ago. "Damn it!" Jake cursed, kicking at a rock. "We're lost." Sarah fought back the rising panic in her chest. They couldn't afford to lose their heads now. "We need to stay calm," she said, though her voice wavered. "Let's keep moving. We have to find them." But deep down, she wasn't sure she wanted to. The memory of Emily's lifeless eyes and blood-stained clothes haunted her, and the thought of finding the others in a similar state was almost too much to bear. The clearing of shadows. As they pressed on, Sarah noticed something strange. The forest seemed to be changing. The trees grew taller and closer together, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out even the faint light of the stars. The ground beneath their feet became soft and spongy, as though they were walking on decaying matter. "Do you smell that?" Jake asked, wrinkling his nose. Sarah nodded. The air was thick with the sickly sweet stench of rotting flesh, so overpowering it made her stomach churn. And then they saw it, a clearing up ahead, bathed in an unnatural red glow. They approached cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the spongy ground. At the center of the clearing was a massive, ancient tree with gnarled roots that seemed to claw their way out of the earth. Hanging from its branches were crude, handmade lanterns, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows. But it wasn't the tree or the lanterns that made Sarah's blood run cold. It was what lay beneath them. The ground was littered with bones, human bones, arranged in intricate patterns. Skulls stared up at them with empty eye sockets, their jaws open in eternal screams. And in the center of it all was a massive slab of stone, slick with blood. This is where it happens, Jake whispered, his face pale. Sarah's stomach turned as the realization sank in. This was the flesh collector's altar. A sudden noise made them both jump. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Run!" Sarah hissed, grabbing Jake's arm. They turned to flee, but the forest seemed to close in around them. The trees were too close together, their branches snagging at their clothes like skeletal hands. The growl grew louder, joined by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. "We're trapped!" Jake shouted, his voice rising in panic. "No, there has to be a way out!" Sarah cried, her flashlight beam darting wildly through the darkness. And then they saw it, a narrow path winding away from the clearing, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Without hesitation, they bolted for it, the sound of the flesh collector's footsteps close behind. They ran until their legs gave out, collapsing in a small open space surrounded by towering trees. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by their labored breathing. "Did we lose it?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake nodded, though his eyes were wide with fear. "I think so." But even as he said it, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She scanned the shadows, her heart pounding, but saw nothing. "Sarah," Jake said suddenly, his voice shaking. She turned to look at him and froze. His flashlight beam was focused on something half buried in the ground, a torn piece of fabric soaked in blood. "That's Lisa's jacket," Jake said, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah felt a fresh wave of terror wash over her. Lisa was here, and she wasn't alone. Before they could react, the tapping sound returned, louder and closer than ever. It was joined by a low, guttural laugh that sent chills down Sarah's spine. "He's toying with us," Jake said, his voice trembling. "He's playing some sick game." Sarah didn't respond. She was too focused on the shadows, her eyes darting frantically as the sound closed in around them. And then she saw it, the faint outline of a figure standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. It was massive, its hunched form illuminated by the faint glow of the lanterns. The flesh collector stepped forward, its hollow eyes glowing with a sickly light. It carried a crude, blood-stained blade in one hand, and its other hand was wrapped around something that made Sarah's stomach drop. It was Alex. His body hung limply in the creature's grip, his eyes wide and unseeing. The flesh collector dropped him unceremoniously to the ground and turned its gaze towards Sarah and Jake. "Run!" Sarah screamed, grabbing Jake's arm and pulling him to his feet. But as they turned to flee, the flesh collector let out an ear-splitting roar and charged. The sound of the flesh collector's roar echoed through the forest, sending chills down Sarah's spine. She could feel the ground trembling beneath her feet as the monstrous figure charged after them, its massive blade scraping against the earth. "Jake, hurry!" she screamed, her voice breaking. Jake stumbled beside her, his breath ragged. His face was pale, and blood dripped from a gash on his leg where a branch had snagged him. "I can't," he wheezed, clutching his side. "I'm slowing you down." "We're not splitting up," Sarah shouted, grabbing his arm and pulling him along. "We stick together." They burst through the dense thicket and found themselves in another clearing. But this one was different. At its center was the mouth of a cave, dark and yawning like the maw of some great beast. Sarah hesitated for only a moment. "In there!" she yelled, dragging Jake toward the entrance. The cave was cold and damp, its walls slick with moisture. Sarah's flashlight beam danced over the jagged rock, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. The air was heavy with the metallic tang of blood, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed around them. "Do you think he'll follow us in here?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. Sarah didn't answer. She didn't want to admit the truth, that there was nowhere they could hide from the flesh collector. They ventured deeper into the cave, their footsteps muffled by the soft, muddy ground. The narrow passage opened up into a cavern, and Sarah froze as her flashlight illuminated what lay ahead. The walls were covered in strips of human skin, stretched taut and pinned like grotesque trophies. Bones were piled in the corners, and crude symbols were scrawled on the walls in dried blood. "This is his lair," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. Before Sarah could respond, a sound behind them made her blood run cold. A low, guttural growl, followed by the scrape of metal against stone. "He's here," she whispered, her voice shaking. They turned to see the flesh collector standing at the entrance to the cavern, his massive frame filling the narrow passage. His glowing eyes locked onto them, and he let out a deep, rumbling laugh that seemed to reverberate through the very walls. Sarah's heart pounded as she looked around desperately for a weapon, anything they could use to defend themselves. Her flashlight beam landed on a jagged piece of rock, and she snatched it up, holding it tightly in her trembling hands. "Stay behind me," she told Jake, her voice firmer than she felt. The flesh collector stepped forward, his blade gleaming in the dim light. Sarah took a deep breath and lunged, swinging the rock with all her strength. The blow glanced off the creature's shoulder, barely making him flinch. He swung his blade in response, and Sarah barely managed to duck in time. "Run, Jake!" she screamed, but Jake didn't move. He stood frozen, his eyes wide with terror. The flesh collector growled and turned his attention to Jake, raising his blade. "No!" Sarah screamed, throwing herself at the creature. She managed to knock him off balance, but he was impossibly strong. He grabbed her by the throat and lifted her off the ground, his glowing eyes boring into hers. "Why?" she gasped, struggling against his grip. "Why are you doing this?" The flesh collector didn't answer. He simply tightened his grip, his lips curling into a twisted smile. As Sarah's vision began to blur, her hand brushed against something cold and sharp. She realized it was one of the bone shards scattered across the cavern floor. With the last of her strength, she grabbed it and plunged it into the flesh collector's arm. The creature roared in pain, dropping her to the ground. Sarah gasped for air and scrambled to her feet, grabbing Jake's arm. "We have to destroy this place," she said, her voice hoarse. Jake nodded, finally snapping out of his stupor. He grabbed one of the lanterns hanging on the wall and hurled it onto the pile of bones. The flames caught instantly, spreading quickly as the oil from the lantern fueled the fire. The flesh collector roared in fury, lunging toward them, but the flames were already consuming his trophies. The cavern filled with smoke, and Sarah and Jake ran toward the entrance, the heat licking at their heels. They burst out of the cave just as the fire reached its peak, collapsing onto the forest floor. Behind them, the cave entrance glowed with an ominous red light, and they could hear the flesh collector's enraged screams echoing from within. For a moment, it seemed like the nightmare was finally over. But then the ground beneath them began to tremble. "What's happening?" Jake asked, his voice panicked. Before Sarah could answer, the cave entrance collapsed, sealing the flesh collector inside. The forest grew eerily silent, and the oppressive weight that had hung in the air seemed to lift. I think it's over," Sarah said, her voice trembling. Jake nodded, but his eyes were filled with doubt. "Let's just get out of here." They stumbled through the forest, their bodies battered and their minds reeling. As they finally emerged onto the main trail, the first light of dawn was breaking through the trees. As they reached their car, Sarah paused and looked back at the forest. It seemed calm and peaceful in the morning light, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. "Do you think he's really gone?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah didn't answer. Instead, she climbed into the car and started the engine, her hands trembling on the wheel. As they drove away, neither of them noticed the faint glow of two hollow eyes watching from the shadows of the forest, nor the low, guttural growl that echoed through the trees. The flesh collector might have been buried, but some legends never die. Story number 2. Harper had always been a city girl. The loud hum of traffic, the bright neon lights, and the crowded streets were all she knew. The smell of coffee in the mornings, the endless chatter at every corner. Everything was familiar, comforting. So when Alex, her boyfriend of 2 years, suggested a weekend camping trip in the middle of nowhere, Harper felt a chill of hesitation ripple through her. I don't know, Alex. What if something goes wrong? What if we get lost? She voiced her doubts, standing in their cramped apartment as she looked over the camping gear he'd laid out on their small coffee table. It all seemed so foreign. But Alex, with his easy smile and carefree attitude, didn't seem concerned. Harper, I swear, it's going to be amazing. Just you, me, and the wild. No distractions, no interruptions, just us and nature. I don't know. She trailed off, glancing at the towering city skyline from their window. Alex pulled her into a gentle embrace, laughing softly. Come on, it'll be great. We could use some time away from all of this. You'll see. After a bit of coaxing, Harper relented. It was true, their lives were a whirlwind. Work, social commitments, endless text messages and emails. Time seemed to slip through their fingers. Maybe a break in the woods was exactly what they needed. As they drove hours away from the bustling city, Harper found herself slowly relaxing. The world around them began to change. Tall buildings turned to open fields, the sky clearer and the air fresher. The closer they got to the campsite, the more peaceful it felt, as if they had entered a different world altogether. Look at this place, Alex said, pulling off the gravel road and into the small clearing where they'd set up camp. Harper gazed out the window, her breath catching at the sight of the towering trees and the serene lake glistening beneath the rising moon. This was what she'd been yearning for, whether she knew it or not. Peace. Solitude. They spent the rest of the afternoon setting up their tent, building a fire and making small talk, their voices mingling with the rustling of the trees and the occasional chirp of crickets. The air was crisp, and for a moment, Harper thought she could feel the weight of the city finally lifting from her shoulders. By the time evening settled in, the fire flickered and popped, casting shadows that danced across the ground. They laughed as they toasted marshmallows, their faces glowing in the orange light. The warmth of the fire, the closeness of Alex. It felt perfect. Harper leaned against Alex, smiling up at him as he stole a kiss. I'm glad we did this. I told you you'd love it, Alex said, his voice low and comforting. Tomorrow we'll hike the trails, maybe even swim in the lake. What do you say? Harper nodded, the unease she'd felt earlier now a distant memory. The night was peaceful, the world outside their little fire-lit circle quiet and still. As they crawled into the tent, exhaustion from the long drive quickly overtook her. Harper closed her eyes, her body sinking into the comfort of the sleeping bag. But just as she was about to drift off, she felt it. A sudden coldness washed over her. Harper stiffened, her heart pounding as her senses heightened. The warmth of the tent, the flickering fire outside, didn't seem to matter anymore. She could hear the faint rustling of leaves, almost imperceptible. Then a whisper, software faint, just enough to send a shiver down her spine. She turned toward Alex, her breath shallow. Alex, she whispered. But he was already fast asleep, his chest rising and falling in a rhythmic pattern. Harper hesitated, her gaze darting toward the flap of the tent. The whispering grew louder, as though someone was right outside. Slowly, she sat up, her fingers trembling as she reached for the zipper. What is it? Alex mumbled, his eyes half-lidded. I thought I heard something. Probably just the wind, Alex said, but his tone was still thick with sleep. He rolled over, facing the other way. Harper lay back down, pulling the blanket closer around her, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. The whispering continued, barely audible like an indistinct hum in the distance. It was soft but insistent. Her skin prickled and her pulse raced. Minutes felt like hours as she stared into the dark canvas of the tent. waiting for the sounds to fade. But they didn't. The whispers kept calling, growing more distinct, more urgent. Finally, unable to take it anymore, Harper threw off her blanket and crawled out of the tent, the cold night air rushing in as she stepped outside. The forest stretched out before her, the shadows deepening beneath the trees. The moon cast a silver glow over the camp, and the fire crackled faintly in the distance. "Hello?" she called into the darkness, her voice quivering despite her efforts to sound steady. "Is someone there?" Nothing. Harper turned sharply, her heart racing. The voice was coming from behind her, yet Alex was still standing near the tent. Her thoughts tangled, and she fought to make sense of it all. Was it truly him? Was it some dark version of him, or something else entirely? The voice spoke again, louder this time, almost a growl. "Harper!" It wasn't Alex. It couldn't be. Harper bolted toward the tent, her feet stumbling over the uneven ground. She had to get inside, had to hide from whatever this was, whatever this force had become. She reached the entrance, but as she pulled back the flap, something icy grabbed her wrist, fingers too cold, too sharp. Her breath hitched in terror, and she twisted in place, but it was too late. The grip tightened, pulling her back into the darkness. In the distance, the forest began to feel alive with something more than the wind. The trees seemed to sway as if in rhythm with a beat she couldn't hear, and the shadows underneath them became almost tangible, like they were reaching for her, pulling her towards the trees. "Get off me!" Harper screamed, but the grip didn't loosen. Her body was dragged, her feet sliding helplessly against the dirt as the force yanked her into the cold abyss of the forest. The firelight, the tent, Alex. Everything seemed so distant now, swallowed by the overwhelming darkness. Her mind raced in panic, but the shadows seemed to blot out every rational thought. As the forest closed around her, the shadows whispered. And this time, the whispering wasn't just one voice. It was dozens, hundreds, filling her head with an incoherent murmur. Words twisted and broke in the air like broken glass. Desire, longing, hunger. Then it hit her. The voice, the shadow, whatever it was mimicking her thoughts, mimicking her deepest, most secret desires. The unspoken, the hidden fantasies of her heart that she hadn't even shared with Alex. It was using them to drive her into madness, feeding on her confusion, her fear, her desperation. "Why are you doing this?" she cried, her voice choked with emotion. The entity laughed, a low, gravelly sound that filled the air. The laugh wasn't Alex's. It wasn't human at all. It felt like it came from the very depths of the forest, from the earth itself. "Because, Harper, I know you. I know what you want, what you crave." The voice was intoxicating, as if it were caressing her mind, teasing her with the things she had long kept hidden away. Harper fell to her knees, the cold earth biting into her palms. Her breaths were ragged, shallow, and the sounds of the forest, the creatures in the dark, the rustling leaves, were drowned out by the voice that continued to whisper to her. "Your fear, your desire, they taste so sweet. Come to me, Harper. You belong to me now." She shook her head violently, pressing her hands to her ears, as if trying to block out the sound, trying to shut out the awful, suffocating presence that seemed to crawl under her skin. But the whispers didn't stop. They pressed into her mind like a parasite, feeding on her every weakness, every crack in her resolve. Harper was losing herself. But then, she saw him again. Alex. But not the Alex she knew. This was something else. Something dark. Something wrong. His figure was blurred, distorted by the shadows, but his eyes, those hollow, soulless eyes, remained locked on her. The realization hit her like a blow to the chest. Alex was gone, and whatever had taken him had now set its sights on her. "Alex?" she gasped, tears welling up in her eyes. "What happened to you?" He didn't respond. Instead, his mouth opened wide, but instead of words, a grotesque, inhuman growl emerged. It echoed through the trees, and Harper felt it vibrate in her bones. The shadows began to close in on her, the whispers growing louder. Her mind screamed for escape, but her body wouldn't respond. She couldn't fight back. She couldn't understand what was happening to her. And then, the voice spoke again. This time, in her own voice, mocking her every word. "Come to me, Harper. You have no choice now. You belong to me. Forever." A cold hand gripped her shoulder, and then, everything went black. Harper's eyes snapped open to an overwhelming darkness, her body aching as though every bone had been crushed. Her chest felt heavy, like an invisible weight was pressing down on her. But there was no air to breathe. The sensation was suffocating. She tried to move, but her limbs wouldn't respond. It was as if she were trapped in a nightmare where the rules of reality no longer applied. "Alex," she whispered hoarsely, her voice barely audible in the dead silence. She couldn't tell if she was still in the forest or somewhere else entirely. The last thing she remembered was being dragged into the depths of the woods, the trees closing in around her like a vice. But now everything was still. Too still. She strained to hear, but the silence was absolute. There was no rustling of leaves, no wind, no life. The sounds of the forest, the cries of the animals, had vanished. Even the horrible whispers from before had been extinguished. The absence of sound was deafening. Harper forced her eyes to adjust to the lack of light. She could make out nothing but a faint outline of her own body, the dark edges of her clothes, and the weightless air around her. Panic began to rise in her throat as she realized how completely isolated she was. The absence of any familiar surroundings only fueled her sense of dread. Was this the afterlife? Had she died in the woods? "No," she murmured, shaking her head with a sudden violent intensity. "I'm still here. I'm still alive." But was she? The question lingered in her mind like a bitter taste, and she could feel the shadows creeping in once more. There was something, someone, else in this place. She could feel its presence, an oppressive force, suffocating her. Then, without warning, the darkness began to shift. It curled around her, folding in on itself as if it were alive. Her breath caught in her throat as the shapes in the dark seemed to take form. It was like a dance, slow and deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. And it was coming closer. The air grew colder, so cold that Harper could see her breath in front of her. She felt the shadows grow more substantial, more physical, as though the darkness itself had weight. And then, footsteps. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was unmistakable. Harper's blood ran cold. It's coming. She tried to call out, to scream, but her throat was dry, her voice a weak rasp. There was no escape. "Alex!" she gasped again, her voice cracking as she called his name, hoping for any response, any trace of the man she had once known. But there was nothing. No answer. Just the endless silence that pressed in on her from every direction. The footsteps grew louder, and Harper felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She couldn't see who or what was approaching, but she could feel it, the malicious presence looming just behind her. Her pulse hammered in her ears, her limbs frozen by a fear she couldn't shake. "Please, no." She closed her eyes tightly, praying for this nightmare to end. But when she opened them again, she wasn't alone. Standing before her, shrouded in shadow, was a figure. At first, it was a vague silhouette, indistinct and blurry, but it slowly took shape, becoming clearer with every heartbeat. And there, in the faint glow of nothingness, she saw it. It was Alex. But it wasn't Alex. The shape, though once human, now had a twisted, unnatural quality to it. His eyes were wide and dark, far too large for his face, their depths impossibly black, as though they had swallowed the very essence of light. His skin was pale, sickly, as if drained of life itself. His mouth hung open, but there was no expression, no recognition, just a chilling emptiness. Harper. The voice that escaped his lips was no longer Alex's. It was something else, something darker, a cold, mechanical mimicry of his voice. The words came out slow, deliberate, as if every sound was being forced from a throat that wasn't his. "Don't be afraid," it whispered. But the words didn't comfort her. Instead, they made her skin crawl. She could see his lips curl upward in an unnatural grin, his face shifting with the grotesque twitch of his jaw. It wasn't right. None of this was right. "What happened to you?" Harper demanded, her voice shaking with the terror she could no longer suppress. She wanted to run, to escape, but she couldn't move. Her body was trapped, paralyzed by the nightmare unfolding before her. Alex, or whatever had taken his form, took a step closer, his footfalls echoing unnervingly in the oppressive silence. The shadows around him seemed to swell, to pulse with some ancient, malevolent energy. The air grew heavier with each step. "You want him back, don't you?" the creature asked, its voice laced with an eerie mockery. It tilted its head as if studying her reaction. "He never really left, Harper. You just haven't accepted it yet." "No," she whispered, shaking her head furiously. "You're not him. You're not Alex." It chuckled darkly, the sound ringing in her ears like nails on a chalkboard. "But I'm all that's left, aren't I? And you're the one who brought me here." It stepped closer, so close now that Harper could feel its icy presence pressing against her skin. "This is your doing, Harper. You called to me. You wanted this." Tears blurred her vision as she tried to fight back the overwhelming surge of panic. "No, I didn't ask for this. I didn't want any of this." Her voice broke as the words came out, raw and desperate. The creature before her laughed again, low and cruel. "But you wanted him. You wanted him more than anything. And now, you have me." The darkness seemed to close in on her then, its tendrils reaching out like a smothering blanket. The more she tried to resist, the tighter it seemed to hold. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. It was as if the very essence of her being was being consumed by the thing in front of her, by whatever twisted ancient power it represented. And in that final moment, Harper realized something far worse than the physical horror that surrounded her. She was not the victim. She was the vessel. And it was too late to escape. Harper's heart was pounding so hard it felt as though it might burst from her chest. The thing, Alex, or what had taken his form, was close now, its presence oppressive, suffocating. The air was thick, laden with the stench of something rotten, a mixture of decay and fear that filled her nostrils with every shallow breath. It was everywhere, the shadows, the darkness, the coldness that wrapped around her like a vice. But Harper wasn't just paralyzed with fear. Something inside her was stirring, a fight, a flicker of defiance, some ember of the woman she once was. She had been made to believe that she was powerless, that the thing in front of her was unstoppable. But she wasn't so sure anymore. If this was a game, then maybe she could still play it. "Let go of me," she whispered, her voice trembling with resolve. It was a desperate attempt to assert control, to remind herself that she was more than just prey. The creature that had once been Alex tilted its head to the side, almost as though it were amused. It watched her with those enormous black eyes, devoid of warmth or life. A laugh, guttural and harsh, bubbled from its throat, echoing in the thick silence around them. "You think you can stop it? You think you can win?" The thing's voice was chilling, not just in its unnaturalness, but in the way it twisted the words, as though savoring her weakness. Harper clenched her fists. She refused to give in, to let this thing take everything from her. But even as she tried to steady her breath, she could feel the weight of the shadows closing in, the reality of the situation pressing against her like an insurmountable wall. Let me show you how much power you have left, it continued, stepping closer until Harper could feel its cold, unnatural breath on her skin. Its words were like ice, each syllable chilling her to the bone. You can't run. You can't hide. You belong to this place now. Number Harper shook her head, feeling her resolve hardening. There was a flicker of something, a memory, something from earlier. The shadows, the whispers, the twisted game that had begun to unfold between her and the entity. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about breaking free. She had to break the cycle, break the hold the thing had on her. She had to destroy it. The shadows seemed to close in even tighter, pressing against her, and Harper felt the weight of them wrapping around her chest, suffocating her. Her eyes burned with unshed tears, but her mind was clear, sharp. No more running. In that moment of clarity, Harper remembered the ritual, the game the entity was playing, using her fears and desires against her. She thought of the whispers, the desire to be wanted, to be loved. The thing had used Alex against her, trying to manipulate her into giving in, into surrendering to the shadows. But that wasn't her desire. It had never been. She had wanted peace. She had wanted to feel free of the shadows, to be free of the terror that had followed her since she first stepped into the forest. You are the one who's afraid, Harper said, her voice gaining strength with each word. You're afraid of me. The thing froze, its black eyes narrowing. It recoiled for a split second, as though it had not expected this from her. It was a subtle moment, but it was enough. Harper seized it. With a quick, decisive movement, she reached for the ground. Her fingers brushed against something cold and jagged, a sharp stone, slick with moisture. Without thinking, she grabbed it, lifting it high above her head. The creature's eyes widened, but it didn't move fast enough. You don't control me anymore, Harper screamed. With a primal scream, she drove the stone into the ground, her force of will driving the weapon into the earth. But the act wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. She wasn't fighting the creature physically. She was breaking its hold over her mind. The shadows screamed in agony, swirling violently around her, thrashing in every direction as though something inside them was tearing apart. The darkness started to pull away from her, retreating as though the very fabric of the shadows were unraveling. Harper fell to her knees, breathless, the weight of the battle draining from her body. Her heart was still pounding in her chest, but the suffocating pressure had lifted. She could breathe again. She could feel again. The creature, or whatever had been pretending to be Alex, let out a low, guttural growl, a sound of frustration and fury. But it was weakening. Harper could see it now, more clearly than ever before. The thing wasn't invincible. It was a parasite, feeding off of fear and desire, clinging to its prey by exploiting their weaknesses. You're nothing, Harper whispered, her voice steadier now, filled with finality. Nothing but a shadow, and you'll disappear just like the rest. The shadows screamed one last time, then collapsed in on themselves. The grotesque figure of Alex, that twisted mockery, faded away into the blackness, leaving nothing but emptiness. For a moment, Harper could hear nothing but the sound of her own breath. The air, which had been so thick with terror, now felt strangely light. The forest, the shadows, everything around her seemed to return to normal, as though the darkness had never existed at all. She looked around. The stars were still above her, the quiet hum of the night filling the air. The oppressive weight that had suffocated her was gone. But she knew that this wasn't over. Not really. The forest was still dangerous. The shadows still lingered just out of sight. But for the first time since she had entered this twisted game, Harper felt free. She had won. The darkness had tried to consume her, tried to turn her into a part of its endless cycle. But she had broken free, and she would never look back. story number 3. The air hung thick with humidity as the group of college friends trudged through the dense woods that surrounded Blood Lake. They had heard rumors of the place before, whispers from locals about the eerie, isolated lake and the stories of strange occurrences that surrounded it. But none of that stopped them. The allure of a weekend getaway, far from civilization and away from the stress of their final exams, was enough to convince them to ignore the warnings. Caleb had been the one to suggest Blood Lake, a secluded spot deep in the forest, hidden from the rest of the world. The very remoteness of the place intrigued him, especially after hearing the eerie legends from an old gas station clerk who had refused to give him directions. But Caleb wasn't the superstitious type. He had always dismissed those kinds of things as myths, and besides, this was going to be the perfect place to escape the pressures of school. Jessica, always the adventurous one, had been eager to come along. She enjoyed the thrill of the unknown, and stories of abandoned places or cursed landmarks only fueled her curiosity. For her, camping out in such a place was an opportunity to experience something out of the ordinary. At first, when they arrived, the lake appeared serene, its water dark and still, surrounded by towering trees. But even in the daylight, the air around it felt heavy, oppressive, as if something ancient lingered beneath the surface. Their campsite was set up just off the shore, with tents pitched in a small clearing. They laughed, exchanged jokes, and cracked open beers, setting up a fire as night began to fall. The air was warm, but there was something unsettling about the silence. The usual sounds of nature, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves, were absent. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. "That's strange," Jessica remarked, standing by the campfire and gazing at the lake. "There's no sound." Caleb shrugged, not really paying attention. Maybe the animals just aren't active tonight. But Jessica felt an inexplicable tension building in her chest, a creeping sensation that something was wrong. Her eyes scanned the trees, her gaze lingering on the shadows that stretched unnaturally long as the firelight flickered and danced. She quickly turned away, trying to shake the feeling. As the others settled into their tents, preparing for bed, Jessica stayed by the fire a little longer. She thought she saw something move across the edge of the water, a flicker of movement, just beyond the reach of the firelight. Frowning, she reached for her flashlight, scanning the area. The light reflected off the water, but there was nothing there. Only the calm, dark surface of the lake. Suddenly, a sharp snap of a twig broke the silence. Jessica's heart skipped a beat. She swung around, scanning the surrounding trees. Nothing. "Stop freaking yourself out," she muttered, trying to convince herself that it was nothing. The air felt oppressive again, thicker now, as if the very forest was alive, watching her. Her instincts told her to leave the fire and return to the safety of the tent, but something made her pause. The sense of curiosity, or perhaps something darker, kept her rooted in place. As she walked closer to the water, the chill in the air deepened, and she realized that her breath was coming out in foggy bursts, even though the night hadn't turned that cold yet. It wasn't until she knelt beside the water that she saw it, a stone half buried in the sand. It was smooth, black, and glistened faintly in the flashlight's beam. Its surface was etched with strange, unfamiliar symbols. They looked ancient, as though carved by hands long forgotten. Jessica reached for it, fingers trembling as she pulled it free from the earth. The moment she held it, a chill washed over her, colder than the air around her. A distant, almost imperceptible whisper reached her ears. Just a low murmur at first, too soft to make sense of. She froze, her hand gripping the stone tighter, the strange symbols now seeming to glow faintly. The whisper grew louder, and Jessica's pulse quickened. It was a language she didn't understand, but there was no mistaking the intent behind it. She was no longer alone. "Jessica," Caleb's voice called out from the camp, but it sounded distant, muffled by the strange presence she felt surrounding her. She turned, hesitated, and then dropped the stone back into the earth, trying to ignore the unsettling sensation growing inside her. The whispering stopped abruptly. "Caleb," Jessica whispered, her throat tight with fear. "Please, this isn't you." But Caleb's eyes burned with an eerie intensity. His smile twisted into something unnatural. "It is me, Jessica. But I've seen what lies beyond the veil. I've seen what you'll never understand." A chill ran down her spine as she realized that Caleb was no longer the friend she once knew. Whatever had claimed him was not of this world. Ryan's voice broke through her thoughts, trembling with urgency. "We need to leave now. This is not him." But as Ryan turned to run back to their tents, a shape emerged from the trees. At first it was just a shadow, but it grew more defined, more terrifying, as it stepped into the firelight. It was tall and thin, its form elongated and unnatural. Its skin was pale, stretched tight over bones that seemed to jut out at odd angles, like a skeletal figure reanimated. Its eyes glowed a sickly green, and its mouth stretched in a cruel, gaping smile. Jessica froze, her heart racing in her chest. This was what they had awakened. The entity. The thing that had been waiting for them to arrive. Before she could react, the creature turned its attention to Caleb, who stood there, his expression empty, like a marionette controlled by the dark forces surrounding them. The creature's skeletal hand reached out and gripped Caleb's shoulder, its touch sending a wave of icy cold through the air. "Caleb!" Jessica screamed, but it was too late. The creature's grip tightened, and Caleb's body jerked violently, as if he were being pulled from within. His eyes rolled back in his head, his mouth opening in a silent scream. Suddenly, everything went dark. The darkness was suffocating. Jessica's breath hitched as she stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest. The once vibrant campfire had gone out in an instant, leaving only the oppressive silence of the woods and the chilling sound of Caleb's muffled screams. She felt Ryan's hand grasp hers tightly, yanking her back from the suffocating terror that seemed to surround them. "We have to go," Ryan said, his voice shaking. "Now!" Jessica wanted to scream, to fight, to run far away, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. The air was thick with something ancient, something vile, and the stench of decay filled her nostrils, making her stomach churn. The creature, still towering over Caleb's limp body, seemed to be feeding off their fear. Its smile grew wider, its sickly green eyes burning with malevolent glee. It spoke again, its voice a low hiss that reverberated through the woods. "Too late. The ritual has begun," it crooned. Jessica wanted to cover her ears to block out the sound, but the words seeped into her mind like poison, wrapping themselves around her thoughts. She tried to tear her gaze away from the nightmare in front of her, but she couldn't. She couldn't stop watching as the creature pulled Caleb's twitching form into the darkness, its skeletal arm curling around his waist as if he were nothing more than a rag doll. "Caleb!" Jessica cried out, but her voice was lost in the night. She felt herself being dragged backwards, Ryan pulling her further away from the campfire, but she couldn't look away. She couldn't stop seeing the horror that was unfolding. The chanting, soft at first, now filled the air, rising and falling like the rhythm of a dark, twisted prayer. It surrounded them, closing in from all directions, and through it all, Caleb's body continued to jerk violently as the creature dragged him deeper into the woods. Ryan's voice trembled as he pulled Jessica with him. "We need to leave. This isn't our fight. We're not strong enough for this." But Jessica shook her head violently. "We can't just leave him," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We can't leave Caleb." Ryan paused, his face pale in the starlight. "Jessica, listen to me. There's nothing we can do. You saw it. Whatever this is, it's not Caleb anymore. We have to get out of here. If we don't..." Before Ryan could finish, a shadow moved out of the corner of Jessica's eye, and she felt a chill brush the back of her neck. Her heart stopped. The creature. It had found them. Ryan grabbed her, pulling her in the opposite direction, but they weren't fast enough. From the blackness of the woods, the creature emerged once again, its elongated body towering above them. Its head twisted unnaturally as it leaned forward, its green eyes locked on Jessica and Ryan with unsettling interest. "Leaving so soon?" it mocked, its voice like the scratching of nails on a chalkboard. Jessica tried to run, but her legs refused to obey. The air had thickened, the pressure making it nearly impossible to breathe. Ryan's grip on her tightened, but even he was slowing, unable to move as quickly as before. "Do you know what this place is?" The creature continued, its form shifting in the dark, undulating like a snake ready to strike. "This place is a gate, a threshold between worlds. You trespassed, and now you will serve." Jessica's stomach churned, and panic bubbled up in her throat. She looked back toward Caleb, who was now standing, his body unnaturally still, his eyes black as midnight. He didn't move, didn't speak. He was merely there. He had become part of the thing that was hunting them. A scream bubbled up inside Jessica's chest, but she couldn't release it. The creature's gaze was on her, its malicious grin widening as it stepped closer. Ryan backed away slowly, his face a mixture of terror and disbelief. "No," he whispered, shaking his head as if willing the nightmare to end. This can't be real." The creature tilted its head, its smile widening further. "This is very real, child," it crooned, taking a step toward them. "And you will not escape." Without thinking, Jessica grabbed Ryan's hand and yanked him into a sprint, her feet barely touching the ground as they ran through the woods, branches slapping their faces, the ground uneven beneath their feet. But they didn't get far. The chanting grew louder and Jessica's heart pounded in her ears. They could hear it now, closer than ever. It wasn't just the creature chasing them. The woods themselves seemed alive, as if they were closing in on them, trapping them in an ever-tightening web. Ryan gasped for breath as they stumbled deeper into the woods. "We need to find a way out," he panted. "There has to be a way out." But Jessica didn't know where to go. She didn't know where to turn. They were lost. Completely and utterly lost in this nightmare. Her mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened, what they had disturbed, but it was all slipping away, like sand through her fingers. And then they reached the clearing. In the center of it was a stone altar, slick with fresh blood. Candles flickered in the wind, casting eerie shadows on the ground. There was no way around it, no way past it. The creature had lured them here. Jessica stopped dead in her tracks, her legs trembling beneath her. Ryan's hand, once gripping hers tightly, fell away. The creature had stopped too, and Caleb, if it was still Caleb, was standing next to the altar, his eyes completely empty. There was no trace of the boy she had once known. He was just a puppet, another vessel for whatever dark force had claimed this place. You've come so far," the creature hissed, its skeletal body towering over them. "But it's too late." Ryan's voice broke. "Please, stop. We didn't mean any harm. We didn't know." The creature's twisted grin stretched wider. "There's no going back, no escape. You are part of this now." With a sudden, terrifying movement, the creature lunged toward them, its skeletal fingers reaching for Ryan. But in that instant, something in Jessica snapped. She screamed, charging at the creature with a newfound strength she didn't know she had. She grabbed one of the candles, the flame flickering wildly in the wind, and slammed it into the creature's chest. The thing let out a hideous screech, a sound that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The air crackled as if the very fabric of reality was ripping. The creature recoiled, its form disintegrating before their eyes, vanishing into the night. But the damage had been done. The world around them was a whirlwind of chaos. Jessica could still feel the heat of the flame against her skin, the desperate intensity of the struggle that had just unfolded. She gasped for breath, her body trembling from both fear and adrenaline as the echoes of the creature's shrieks faded into the dark woods. Ryan was beside her, just as shaken, his eyes wild with disbelief. What just happened?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "Is it gone? Is it over?" Jessica couldn't answer. She didn't know if it was truly gone. The creature had vanished into thin air, but a part of her feared that it was merely biding its time, preparing for the next step in its twisted game. The air was thick with a sense of impending doom, and the weight of the ritual they had interrupted pressed heavily on her chest. "We have to keep moving," she said, her voice hoarse. She grabbed Ryan's hand, pulling him toward the edge of the clearing. "If we stay here, we'll never escape." Ryan nodded numbly, his expression still distant. He wasn't entirely present, not fully aware of the gravity of what had just occurred. But Jessica couldn't blame him. Her mind was unraveling as well, the horrific images of the creature and Caleb's soulless form flashing in her memory like a nightmare that wouldn't end. They stumbled through the woods, their steps clumsy and disoriented. The moon above them was barely visible, obscured by thick clouds that seemed to press down on the earth. It was as though the very sky was against them. And then, they heard it again, the chanting. It started as a whisper, barely audible, but it grew louder with every passing second, surrounding them, echoing off the trees. Jessica's pulse quickened. "It's not over," she gasped, her eyes darting frantically around the forest. "It's still here. We're not alone." Ryan's hand tightened around hers, his breath shallow and quick. "We need to get out of here. We need to leave this place." But Jessica wasn't listening anymore. The chanting was growing stronger, and her mind was racing, pulling her in a direction she didn't want to go. Her body had already begun moving forward, pulling Ryan along with her. "We need to finish what we started," she muttered under her breath, her voice distant, as though she were being controlled by something she couldn't explain. Ryan's confusion was palpable. "What are you talking about?" he asked, trying to stop her, to pull her back to reality. "We don't have time for this. We need to get help. We need to get out of here before..." Before he could finish his sentence, something in the air shifted. A crackling energy filled the woods, the ground trembling beneath their feet. The trees seemed to bend in on themselves, their twisted forms reaching down toward them as if they were alive. Jessica froze. In the distance, just beyond the edge of the clearing, a faint light flickered. At first, she thought it was a trick of her mind, a figment of the darkness trying to deceive her. But as she focused, the light grew brighter, and a figure emerged from the shadows. A figure she knew all too well. "Caleb?" she whispered, her heart sinking in her chest. Ryan's grip on her arm tightened, his eyes widening with fear. "No," he said firmly. "That's not Caleb. That's something else." The figure drew closer, and Jessica felt the air around them grow colder, the temperature dropping rapidly as the figure stepped into the clearing. It was Caleb, or at least it looked like him, but his eyes were hollow, completely black, and his skin was pale, stretched tight over his bones. His movements were jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge them in any way. He simply walked forward, his gaze locked on Jessica with a chilling intensity. "No," Jessica whispered, her body trembling. "Caleb, what's happening to you? What have they done to you?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it reached out with long, bony fingers, its grip tight and unyielding as it seized Jessica's arm. Ryan lunged forward, shouting her name, but the moment he touched the creature's shoulder, he was thrown backward, crashing into a nearby tree with a sickening thud. Jessica screamed as she felt herself being dragged toward the altar, her feet slipping through the wet, sticky blood on the ground. "Ryan!" she cried out, but he was unconscious, unable to reach her. The creature, Caleb or whatever it was now, pulled her closer to the altar, its grip unrelenting, and Jessica realized in horror that she was going to become part of the ritual. She had unwittingly sealed their fates the moment they entered this cursed place. Tears streamed down her face as she struggled against the thing that had once been her friend. "Please, let me go," she begged, her voice desperate. But Caleb didn't respond. His hollow eyes stared at her without emotion, like an empty shell, and she realized with a sickening certainty that there was no humanity left in him. He was nothing more than a vessel, a puppet controlled by whatever dark force had taken root in this cursed place. A voice, low and whispering, filled the air around them, the chant continuing, growing louder and more insistent. "The ritual will be complete." Jessica's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing as she realized that she was about to be the final piece of a twisted, unholy sacrifice. The creature would finish what it had started. She could feel it closing in on her, the darkness wrapping around her like a vice. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing pain shot through her chest, and she gasped in horror. Looking down, she saw Caleb's bony hand thrusting a blood-stained knife into her heart. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came. She was already dying. Her vision blurred as the darkness closed in on her, and she felt herself slipping away. But just before she succumbed to the darkness, she saw something impossible, through the haze of her fading consciousness. Ryan. He wasn't dead. With a surge of desperate energy, Ryan sprang to his feet, his eyes filled with wild determination. He saw Jessica, saw the blade in Caleb's hand, and in that instant, he knew what he had to do. He had to save her. But in doing so, he would pay the ultimate price. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest, his body pulsing with adrenaline as the cold night air whipped around him. His mind was a blur of panic, but a single clear thought echoed through his consciousness. "I can't lose her." He pushed himself off the ground, the world spinning around him. His vision focused, locking onto the figure of Caleb, the creature that had once been his friend, his companion, and now was nothing more than an empty shell of malice. But that wasn't what terrified Ryan most. It was Jessica. Her body lay limp in Caleb's grasp, her blood slowly pooling around the altar, and her chest rising and falling only faintly. She was still alive, but barely. Ryan stumbled forward, the air growing thick with an unnatural pressure. His feet felt heavy, as though the earth itself were resisting his every step. The chanting grew louder, the words indistinguishable but hauntingly familiar. It was as if the very forest itself was alive, drawn into the malevolent force that controlled this place. He had to act, and fast. His eyes flicked back to the altar. Caleb stood motionless, staring down at Jessica with hollow eyes, the knife still lodged in her chest. The blood poured from her wound, and each drop seemed to make the ground tremble beneath them. Ryan could see it now. The altar wasn't just a random stone formation. It was a tool, a conduit for something much darker, something older than they could comprehend. "No," Ryan whispered, his voice shaking. He had no plan, no real understanding of what was happening. But he knew one thing. He couldn't let this happen. Not to Jessica. Not to anyone else. Caleb turned his head toward Ryan, his movements stiff and unnatural. His mouth stretched into a grin that was far too wide, revealing teeth too sharp to be human. The creature tilted its head as if to study Ryan, its black eyes glimmering with something sinister. "It knows I'm here," Ryan thought. "It's waiting for me." In that moment, Ryan's fear evaporated. It wasn't just fear of the creature, or the ritual, or the dark, oppressive energy that surrounded him. It was a deeper, primal fear. Fear for Jessica's life. He had to save her. He had to stop this. Ryan ran, the blood pounding in his ears. With every step, the world seemed to distort, but he couldn't stop now. Jessica's life depended on him. The ground beneath his feet shook again, this time with more force. The altar seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the moon, and for a split second, Ryan saw something impossibly large, hovering just beyond the edge of his vision. But he didn't stop. He reached Caleb just as the creature turned, raising the knife once again. "No!" Ryan shouted, throwing himself at Caleb's arm. The knife wavered for a moment, then plunged downward with a sickening thud, missing Ryan by inches. Caleb hissed, an inhuman guttural sound, but Ryan wasn't fazed. He grabbed Caleb by the throat, his hands shaking but resolute. "Let her go," he growled, his voice a hoarse whisper of defiance. He wasn't even sure if the creature could hear him, if it even cared. But there was no time to waste. As Ryan's hands tightened around Caleb's throat, the creature's grip on Jessica loosened, and she slid away from the altar, her body still twitching, her breath shallow. Ryan had only seconds to act. He grabbed the knife from the altar, his fingers slick with blood. It felt impossibly cold in his hand, and as he held it, he could almost feel the evil that had seeped into its blade. The whispers around him intensified, growing louder, the chanting becoming almost unbearable, a cacophony of voices pressing against his skull. But none of that mattered. With a cry of pure desperation, Ryan slammed the knife into Caleb's side, deep, hard, and fast. Caleb's body jerked as the blade cut through its flesh, but it didn't scream. It didn't bleed in the way Ryan had expected. Instead, it let out a low, menacing laugh, a laugh that sounded almost like the wind itself. Ryan froze, horror creeping back into his chest as Caleb's body convulsed, his form twisting in unnatural ways. His black eyes turned toward Ryan, and for the first time, the creature spoke. You think this will stop it?" Caleb's voice was a distorted echo, unrecognizable, a mockery of the human being he had once been. "You cannot undo what has already begun. You cannot stop what was summoned." Ryan felt the ground beneath his feet tremble as Caleb's form began to shift and melt. The creature's body collapsed in on itself, turning into a mass of dark, writhing tendrils that slithered toward the altar. The chanting reached a deafening crescendo, and Ryan could feel the very air vibrate with the power of the entity they had so recklessly disturbed. Jessica stirred behind him, her breath coming in sharp gasps as she clutched her chest. She was alive. She was going to make it. But Ryan had no illusions of escaping this nightmare. The darkness that had gripped this place was not done. The ritual was far from over. The ground beneath them seemed to buckle, the earth itself pulling away to reveal an abyss of blackened stone. "We need to leave," Jessica whispered, her voice strained but steady. "Now, Ryan, please." Ryan turned to her, his eyes wide with fear. He couldn't understand why she wasn't panicking, why she was still calm despite the horrors around them. But he didn't have time to question it. The darkness was closing in, and they needed to run. With one final look at the altar, at the twisted remnants of Caleb, Ryan grabbed Jessica's hand and pulled her into the woods. The ground was shaking beneath their feet as they ran, the air growing colder and colder. The trees around them seemed to reach out with gnarled fingers, their branches creaking like the bones of the dead. The chanting was relentless, echoing in every direction. But as they fled, the sounds of the forest began to distort, warping into something else, something ancient. The world seemed to collapse in on itself, the sky turning a sickly shade of red as the ritual completed itself in the distance. They were trapped. They reached the edge of the clearing and suddenly the sound stopped. The wind died. The trees stopped moving. It was as though the world had been frozen in time. Ryan felt his heart stop as he looked around. "We're not getting out, are we?" Jessica whispered, her voice hollow. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. "No," Ryan replied, his voice trembling with the bitter truth. "We're not." A shadow moved behind them, and when they turned, there was no one there, only the darkness. The ritual had claimed them, and there was no escape. Story number 4. The fire crackled as the last rays of sunlight dipped behind the trees, giving way to the eerie darkness of the forest. The sound of laughter mixed with the crackling of the flames as Sarah glanced around, taking in the faces of her closest friends. It had been a while since they'd all gotten together, and when Grace suggested a weekend camping trip deep in the woods, everyone had agreed almost immediately. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to escape the stress of their daily lives and reconnect. Sarah glanced at the surrounding trees, tall and looming, their branches swaying slightly in the cool evening breeze. The forest had an ancient quality to it, as though it had been there for centuries, unbroken and untouched by time. She'd grown up going camping, but there was something about this place that felt different. She couldn't quite place it, but the sensation lingered in the back of her mind, like an itch she couldn't scratch. "We're going to have so much fun." Grace's voice broke through Sarah's thoughts, and she turned to see her friend smiling brightly. Grace had a way of making even the most mundane situations feel exciting. She had a way of lighting up the room, of making everything feel lighthearted and carefree. "Totally," Sarah agreed, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She watched as John cracked open another beer, his face already flushed with alcohol, and Ben sat by the fire, his eyes distant and thoughtful. He had been unusually quiet since they arrived, but then again, Ben had always been a bit of an enigma. "I'll say this much," John said, raising his can. "This is already better than the city. No stress, no deadlines, just us and the trees." The others cheered in agreement, and Sarah forced a smile. It wasn't that she didn't enjoy being with her friends, but there was something about the forest that unsettled her. The air felt too thick, like it was pressing down on her chest. The trees, so still and silent, seemed to watch them. She shook off the feeling, telling herself it was just her imagination. After all, she'd been out here plenty of times before. But then, she heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible moan coming from somewhere in the distance. It sounded like someone in pain, but it was so far away that she couldn't tell where it was coming from. Sarah frowned, straining to hear it again, but the sounds of her friends laughing and talking drowned it out. She glanced around, her heart beginning to race slightly. "Did you hear that?" she asked quietly, but the group was too immersed in their conversation to notice. "You okay?" Grace asked, noticing Sarah's distracted expression. "You seem off." "Yeah," Sarah replied quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired. It's been a long day." Grace didn't look convinced, but she didn't press the matter. Instead, she stood up and waved her hand dramatically. "All right, everyone, we've got the perfect setup. Let's make the most of it. Who's up for some ghost stories?" The others cheered, and Sarah forced herself to laugh, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in her stomach. She could see the way the firelight flickered in the eyes of her friends, casting shadows that made them look slightly otherworldly. The feeling of being watched intensified, but she told herself it was just her nerves. As the night deepened, the forest seemed to grow quieter. The moan she had heard earlier had faded, but now there was an unsettling stillness to the air. The crackling fire was the only sound, and it sounded too loud in the silence. The trees around them stood like silent sentinels, unmoving in the dark. "You know," Ben said suddenly, breaking the quiet, "I've heard some strange stories about this place." Sarah turned to look at him, raising an eyebrow. Ben was usually the quiet, enigmatic type, but when he spoke, people listened. "What kind of stories?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. "About the forest," Ben replied, his eyes scanning the tree line as if he could see something Sarah couldn't. "They say it's not like other forests. That something lives here, and if you disturb it, it comes for you." "Disturb it how?" John asked, his voice filled with mock disbelief. "Like cutting down a tree or something?" Ben shook his head slowly, a dark look crossing his face. "No, not cutting down trees. Something deeper. Something that's been here long before any of us. Grace laughed, but it was more nervous than anything else. You're just messing with us, Ben. You know I hate ghost stories. I'm serious, Ben replied, his voice low. They say this forest has a hunger, and if you don't respect it, it'll take something from you. Sarah felt a cold chill run through her spine, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she forced a laugh, trying to make light of the situation. It's just a story, right? No need to get all spooky on us. But Ben's eyes didn't leave the tree line. There was something unnerving about his stare, like he could see something moving in the shadows. As Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat, she glanced around. The wind had picked up, and the trees seemed to sway slightly, as though they were whispering to each other. There it was again, an odd, faint sound, like the trees were breathing. She blinked and looked again, but the noise was gone. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She glanced over at Grace, who was laughing along with John, and tried to convince herself that it was nothing. But in her gut, something told her the stories Ben had shared weren't just stories. The forest was alive, and it was watching them. The fire crackled, the embers glowing in the night as the temperature began to drop. They passed around more beers, the mood lightening once again. The conversation turned back to the usual banter, but Sarah's mind lingered on what Ben had said. There was something unsettling in the way he spoke, something more than a campfire story. Her eyes wandered over the tree line, where the shadows of the trees seemed deeper, darker than they should be. They stood tall and unyielding, like silent sentinels, watching and waiting. And yet, in the faint moonlight, she could have sworn she saw a flicker of movement between the trunks. The forest was shifting. The air felt heavier now, thicker with each passing minute. Sarah's throat tightened, and she couldn't help but glance back at the others. They were still chatting and laughing, oblivious to the strange sense of unease that had settled over her. But her gut told her that something was wrong. She had to tell them. But what? How could she explain the creeping sense of dread that clawed at her insides without sounding completely irrational? But before she could open her mouth, there was a sudden, sharp crack. Everyone froze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the usual forest noises. It was something, or someone, stepping in the underbrush. The sudden crack of a branch snapping sent a jolt through Sarah's body, her heart racing in her chest. The laughter died down as the others turned toward the sound, eyes wide, and a collective silence fell over the group. It was as though the entire forest held its breath, waiting for the next move. Was that... Grace began, but her voice faltered as she looked into the dark expanse of trees ahead of them. It was hard to pinpoint exactly where the noise had come from. Too distant, too ambiguous. Ben's face had gone pale, his eyes narrowed, scanning the shadowed edges of the clearing. He'd been the one to speak of the forest's unnatural power, and now he seemed to understand something the others did not. His lips barely moved as he muttered under his breath, almost too quietly for Sarah to hear. That wasn't an animal. The others, still not fully comprehending, began to laugh nervously, dismissing the noise as some creature of the woods, perhaps a deer, or a large bird that had taken flight in the dark. "Relax," John said, his tone teasing. "It's just some critter in the woods, probably a raccoon or something." But Sarah could see the way Ben's gaze lingered on the shadows, the deep-set lines of worry around his eyes. There was no mistaking it. He wasn't just being paranoid. Something was out there, something more than an animal. The fire crackled again, louder this time, as if feeding off their tension. Sarah swallowed, trying to steady herself. It was just her imagination. The dark woods had a way of playing tricks on the mind, especially after the sun went down. But then, the whispering started. At first it was faint, a soft, almost inaudible hum that seemed to rise and fall like the wind. But as the moments stretched, the whispers grew more distinct, as though dozens of voices were speaking all at once, just beyond the edge of their hearing. It was coming from the trees. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling despite herself. John laughed nervously, but his smile faded as he too began to hear it. The low, guttural hum, almost like a chant. The others fell silent, now aware of the unsettling sound that filled the air. "It's just the wind," Grace said, though her voice lacked conviction. She glanced over at Ben, who was now standing, his eyes fixed on the trees with a look of pure dread. "No," Ben replied, shaking his head slowly. "That's not the wind." Suddenly the whispers became clearer, more urgent. The air felt thick, pressing against Sarah's skin. The branches above seemed to sway of their own accord, as if being moved by some unseen force. The forest was alive in a way that was no longer natural. Without thinking, Sarah stood up. Her legs felt heavy, as though something was anchoring her to the ground. But she forced herself to take a step toward the edge of the clearing, toward the trees. She wasn't sure why she felt compelled to move, but there was something in the air that was pulling her forward, beckoning her to come closer. The sound of the chanting grew louder, more insistent. "Sarah, don't!" Grace called, her voice full of panic. But Sarah couldn't stop. She took another step forward, and then another, moving further into the dark woods, leaving the warmth of the campfire behind. The trees seemed to part before her, as if making way for her to pass, guiding her deeper into the shadows. The chanting was louder now, almost tangible, reverberating in her chest like the beat of a drum. It was as if the forest itself was breathing in time with the sound, as if it was feeding on her presence. Sarah's breath quickened as she stumbled forward, her mind hazy and unfocused. She had to see it. Whatever it was. The thing that was making the sound. The thing that was calling to her. Behind her, the others shouted her name, but their voices felt distant now, muffled by the oppressive air around her. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment, she felt the crushing weight of panic rising inside her. She wanted to turn back, to run to the safety of the campfire and her friends. But she couldn't. She couldn't stop herself. And then, as though from nowhere, a face appeared. It wasn't a person's face, but something far more unsettling. It was a face formed from the bark of one of the ancient trees, its features twisted and distorted. The eyes were wide, black voids that seemed to suck in the light around them, and the mouth was a jagged, wide slit, stretching unnaturally across the bark. It opened, and a low, guttural sound, like a sigh, rumbled from deep within the tree, sending a wave of cold through Sarah's veins. She froze, her mind reeling. What was it? Was it real? Was she losing her mind? And then, as though the tree's face were a gateway, the whispers began to take shape, coalescing into a single voice. It was low and gravelly, but the words were like a pull, a magnetic force drawing her in closer. "Come closer, child," the voice murmured, its tone both soothing and sinister. "We are waiting for you." Sarah took a shaky step forward, and then another. The voice seemed to wrap around her, urging her onward. She didn't know why, but she couldn't resist. Something deep inside her, something primal, urged her to give in, to listen. Behind her, Grace and John had stopped shouting. The air was so thick now that Sarah could barely hear anything. The forest felt like it was closing in, suffocating her with its presence. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the tree. The bark felt alive beneath her touch, warm, pulsing as if it had a heartbeat of its own. Suddenly, the face in the tree twisted. The mouth opened wide, impossibly wide, and out from the blackness of its throat came a wail, a scream that seemed to tear through Sarah's soul. The scream wasn't human. It was something ancient, something beyond comprehension. Sarah stumbled back, her body trembling as the scream echoed in her mind. She turned to run, but the world around her had changed. The trees had shifted, and the path she had taken was gone. The forest had swallowed it up, leaving her disoriented and lost. The ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse, as though the earth itself was alive. breathing in and out, drawing her deeper into its dark embrace. Her heart raced as she turned in frantic circles, trying to spot her friends, trying to find a way out. But the forest was no longer the same. It had transformed into something else, something far more sinister. The air was thick, suffocating, and the trees, once still, now loomed over her like towering sentinels, their branches creaking and groaning as though they were alive. "Sarah!" Grace's voice pierced through the oppressive silence, but it was distant, as though it came from a dream. "Where are you?" Sarah tried to call out, but her voice caught in her throat, strangled by fear. She took a step forward, but the ground seemed to shift beneath her feet, and the trees bent and twisted, their shadows swallowing her whole. And then, just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, a shape appeared before her. It was a person, or something that resembled one. A tall figure emerged from the darkness, cloaked in shadow, its face hidden beneath the hood of its cloak. But the feeling that radiated from it was unmistakable. It was the forest, the one that had been calling her. The figure spoke, its voice a low, rasping whisper that cut through the fog of fear clouding Sarah's mind. "Welcome to the forest, Sarah. You're part of it now. You've been chosen." Sarah's knees buckled as the figure before her spoke. Its voice wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, something that burrowed deep into her mind and rattled the very core of her being. The words echoed, repeating endlessly in her head. "You've been chosen." Her breath came in shallow, panicked gasps as she stumbled back, but the forest didn't allow her escape. The trees leaned inward, their gnarled branches forming an impenetrable cage around her. The ground beneath her feet pulsed like a heartbeat, and she could feel it pulling her down, as though the earth itself wanted to consume her. "No!" Sarah screamed, her voice breaking. "I don't want this! I didn't ask for this!" The hooded figure tilted its head, as if amused by her defiance. Slowly it raised an arm, the black cloak falling away to reveal a limb that was not flesh, but a twisted amalgamation of wood, bark, and sinew. The hand, if it could even be called that, had fingers sharp like roots, curling and uncurling as though alive. "You came here," the figure rasped, its voice blending with the whispers of the forest. "You disturbed our slumber. Now you belong to us." The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices chanting in unison. Sarah clutched her head, trying to block them out, but they were inside her now, burrowing into her thoughts like parasitic worms. Suddenly there was a shout in the distance, Grace's voice, sharp and desperate. "Sarah, where are you?" The sound snapped Sarah back to reality. Her friends, they were still out there. She couldn't let the forest take her, not without a fight. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, she turned and ran, pushing through the thick underbrush and clawing at the vines that tried to ensnare her. The hooded figure didn't follow, but the forest itself seemed to shift in response to her flight. The trees twisted and groaned, their branches reaching for her like skeletal hands. The ground rippled beneath her, making every step feel like she was wading through quicksand. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. "Grace! John! Ben!" she screamed, her voice raw. "Help me!" Through the oppressive darkness, she saw a faint glow ahead, the campfire. Relief flooded her chest as she stumbled into the clearing, collapsing to her knees. Her friends turned to her, their faces pale and drawn. "Sarah!" Grace rushed to her side, pulling her into a tight embrace. "What happened? Where did you go?" Sarah tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. How could she explain what she had seen, what she had felt? The forest was alive. It was watching them, and it wasn't going to let them leave. "We need to get out of here," she finally managed, her voice trembling. "Now. Right now." John frowned, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about? We can't just—" Before he could finish, a deep, guttural groan echoed through the clearing. The sound was low and resonant, vibrating through their bodies like the rumble of thunder. Everyone froze, their eyes wide with fear. What the hell was that? Ben whispered, his voice barely audible. The answer came in the form of movement. The trees surrounding the clearing began to shift, their trunks twisting and contorting as though they were alive. Faces emerged from the bark, grotesque and distorted, their hollow eyes fixed on the group. "Oh my God," Grace breathed, clutching Sarah's arm. "What is this?" The chanting returned, louder now, and with it came a suffocating sense of dread. The air was thick and heavy, pressing down on them like an invisible weight. The fire crackled and flared, its flames turning an unnatural shade of green before sputtering out entirely, plunging them into darkness. "Run!" Sarah screamed, grabbing Grace's hand and pulling her toward the path that led back to the road. The others followed, their footsteps pounding against the ground as they fled into the forest. But the forest wasn't letting them go. The path twisted and turned, leading them in circles. No matter which direction they ran, they always ended up back where they started. The trees loomed over them, their branches forming a canopy so dense that not even the moonlight could penetrate. "We're trapped!" John shouted, his voice tinged with panic. "We're not getting out of here!" "Don't say that," Grace snapped, though her own voice wavered. "There has to be a way." But deep down, they all knew the truth. The forest was alive, and it wanted them. As they ran, Sarah felt something cold brush against her ankle. She looked down and saw a root snaking its way up her leg, tightening like a noose. She screamed, kicking at it, but more roots emerged from the ground, wrapping around her limbs and pulling her down. "Sarah!" Grace turned back, her eyes wide with terror. She lunged forward, grabbing Sarah's arm and trying to pull her free, but the roots were too strong. "Go!" Sarah cried, tears streaming down her face. "You have to go!" "No, I'm not leaving you!" Grace screamed, but before she could do anything more, the ground beneath them gave way. They fell into darkness. The moaning of the forest had grown louder, filling the air with a terrible symphony of anguish and despair. The trees no longer stood as lifeless sentinels. They swayed unnaturally, their bark twisting to reveal grotesque faces contorted in silent screams. The ground pulsed beneath their feet, as though the forest itself were alive and breathing. Hannah clutched her flashlight tightly, its beam trembling as much as her hand. The group huddled together, each person's face painted with terror. "We have to keep moving," she whispered. "We can't stay here." "We're going to die here," Chris muttered, his voice hollow. "This place, it's feeding on us." "Shut up," Mark snapped. "If we give in to fear, we're done. We stick together and find a way out." But deep down, they all knew the truth. The forest wasn't letting them leave. As they pushed forward, the path twisted in ways that defied logic. Landmarks they had passed earlier now appeared in front of them, as if the forest itself were folding in on them. Worse, the whispers began again, louder this time, and with them came a new, bone-chilling sound, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, but not their own. "Who's there?" Hannah called, spinning around. Her flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, landing on nothing. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a man, or at least what remained of one. His skin was gray and mottled, his eyes sunken and lifeless. His clothes hung in tattered strips, and his mouth moved, though no words came out. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered. The man raised a skeletal hand and pointed at them. His mouth stretched open, wider and wider, until an inhuman wail erupted, shaking the very trees around them. "Run!" Mark shouted. The group scattered, the illusion of safety in numbers shattered. Hannah sprinted through the trees, her lungs burning and her heart pounding like a war drum. The forest seemed to close in around her, branches clawing at her clothes and skin. Behind her, she could hear the others screaming. She didn't dare look back. After what felt like hours, Hannah stumbled into a clearing. In the center stood an enormous tree, its trunk as wide as a house and its branches stretching high into the night sky. Its bark was black as coal, and faces swirled across its surface, their expressions frozen in torment. The air here was thick and oppressive, and the ground beneath her feet felt warm, almost alive. Hannah fell to her knees, gasping for air. She looked up at the tree and realized with dawning horror that it was the source of the forest's power. This was the heart of the forest, the place where it claimed its victims. "Hannah!" She turned to see Mark stumble into the clearing, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead. His eyes widened as he took in the monstrous tree. "What the hell is this?" "It's the forest," Hannah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's alive, and it wants us." The ground trembled beneath them, and roots began to snake toward them, writhing like living things. Mark grabbed Hannah's arm and pulled her to her feet. "We have to destroy it," he shouted. "With what?" Hannah cried. "We don't have anything." Mark's eyes darted around the clearing, landing on a pile of bones at the base of the tree. Among them was a rusted axe, its blade dull but still intact. "That'll do," he said, sprinting toward it. "Mark, no!" Hannah shouted, but it was too late. As Mark grabbed the axe, the tree let out a deafening roar. Faces began to emerge from its bark, screaming in silent agony as the roots surged toward him. Mark swung the axe with all his strength, the blade biting into the tree's trunk. The forest shrieked in pain, the sound reverberating through the clearing. Hannah covered her ears, her head pounding with the noise. Mark swung again and again, each strike sending shockwaves through the ground. But with each blow, the roots grew more aggressive, wrapping around his legs and pulling him toward the tree. "Mark!" Hannah screamed. "Go!" he shouted. "You have to finish this." Hannah hesitated for only a moment before rushing to his side. She grabbed the axe from his hands and swung with all her might, the blade sinking deep into the tree's black bark. The tree let out a final ear-splitting wail as its trunk split open, revealing a pulsating, glowing core. Hannah didn't think. She swung the axe one last time, driving it into the core. The forest exploded in a blinding flash of light. Hannah was thrown backward, landing hard on the ground. When she opened her eyes, she saw the tree disintegrating, its bark crumbling to ash and its roots shriveling away. The faces on its surface vanished, their expressions of torment replaced with peace. Hannah sat up, her body aching. The clearing was silent now, the oppressive weight of the forest lifted. She looked around for Mark and saw him lying a few feet away, motionless. "Mark," she called, crawling to his side. She shook him gently, but he didn't respond. His chest wasn't moving. Tears streamed down her face as she realized he was gone. Days later, Hannah sat on the edge of her bed in a hospital room, staring out the window. The authorities had found her unconscious at the edge of the forest. They didn't believe her story, chalking it up to hysteria and exhaustion. But Hannah knew the truth. The forest was gone, its curse broken, and while she had survived, she would never forget the horrors she had witnessed or the friends she had lost. As she stared into the distance, she thought she saw something move among the trees. A shadow, just for a moment, before it disappeared. Hannah closed her eyes and whispered a silent prayer. Some things she knew could never truly be destroyed. Story number 5. The forest greeted them like a living entity, its towering pines swaying gently in the breeze as though acknowledging their arrival. Dappled sunlight filtered through the canopy, illuminating pockets of vibrant moss and scattered pine needles across the uneven ground. The group walked in single file, backpacks heavy with supplies, their laughter and idle chatter echoing faintly in the vast expanse of wilderness. Emily led the way, her hand clutching the crumpled map she had spent weeks studying. She had always been the planner among them, meticulously organizing every trip down to the last detail. This camping excursion was no different. "We're almost there," she called over her shoulder, her voice bright with enthusiasm. Just another half-mile or so. Another half-mile? Nick groaned from the rear of the line. He swatted at a mosquito buzzing near his ear. We've been hiking for hours, Em. Are you sure we're not lost? Emily turned to shoot him a withering look. I'm sure. You'd know that if you'd helped plan instead of complaining the whole way. Come on, Nick. Don't be such a baby, Sarah teased, her ponytail bouncing as she walked. It's good for you to disconnect from your phone for a while. Enjoy nature. Yeah, Nick, Jake chimed in, grinning. Take a deep breath. Smell that fresh air. Isn't it great? Nick muttered something under his breath about preferring Wi-Fi over pine-scented wilderness, but he kept walking. Mia, the quietest of the group, adjusted her camera strap and snapped a photo of a cluster of mushrooms growing at the base of a tree. She had a keen eye for detail, always seeking beauty in the smallest things. This place is amazing, she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. The trail narrowed as they approached the stream Emily had marked on the map. The sound of rushing water grew louder, mingling with the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. When they finally broke through the dense undergrowth, the sight before them was almost magical. The stream sparkled in the sunlight, its crystal-clear water tumbling over smooth stones. The clearing they had chosen as their campsite was shaded by tall trees, their roots gnarled and ancient, twisting in intricate patterns across the ground. This is perfect, Emily said, her voice filled with satisfaction. She dropped her backpack and stretched, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease. Jake clapped his hands together. All right, let's set up camp. I'm starving, and I'm not waiting until sundown to eat. As the group busied themselves pitching tents and unpacking supplies, the atmosphere was filled with a sense of camaraderie. They worked together seamlessly, laughing and joking as they hammered stakes into the ground and unrolled sleeping bags. Campfire tonight? Sarah asked as she unzipped her backpack and pulled out a bag of marshmallows. Of course, Emily replied, but first, we'll need firewood. Jake volunteered to gather wood, and Sarah and Mia decided to join him. The trio ventured deeper into the forest, their voices fading as they moved out of sight. Nick, predictably, plopped down in a camping chair and tore open a bag of chips. Wake me up when the fire's ready, he said, reclining lazily. Emily shook her head but didn't comment. Instead, she focused on organizing their supplies, arranging them neatly in the center of the clearing. She liked things to be orderly, a habit that often drew teasing from her friends but made her feel in control. Minutes turned into an hour, and Emily began to wonder what was taking the others so long. Just as she was about to call out for them, Jake's voice echoed through the trees. Guys, you have to see this! Emily's heart sank. Jake's tone was a mixture of excitement and unease, the kind of voice he used when he found something he probably shouldn't have. What now? Nick muttered, reluctantly getting to his feet. Emily and Nick followed the sound of Jake's voice, weaving through the trees until they found the trio standing in a small clearing. In the center of the space was a large, flat stone partially buried in the ground. The surface was covered in strange, weathered carvings, their intricate patterns seemingly random, but oddly mesmerizing. What is it? Emily asked, her voice cautious. No idea, Jake replied, crouching to trace the symbols with his fingers. But it looks old, really old. Mia snapped a photo, her brow furrowed in concentration. It's beautiful, she murmured. It's creepy, Sarah countered, crossing her arms. We should leave it alone. Jake ignored her, brushing away more dirt to reveal additional carvings. It's like a piece of history just sitting out here. How cool is that? It's not cool, Emily said firmly. It's probably part of some burial site or something. We should leave it alone. Nick took a step back, shaking his head. Yeah, I'm with Emily on this one. This feels wrong. But Jake was already engrossed, his curiosity overriding any sense of caution. Come on, it's just a rock. What's the worst that could happen? Emily sighed, her instincts screaming at her to leave, but the group eventually returned to camp with no further incident. As they sat around the fire that evening, the stone slab lingered in Emily's thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling that they had disturbed something that was meant to remain hidden. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the night sky, and the group's laughter filled the clearing. But Emily's eyes kept drifting toward the dark woods beyond the firelight, where shadows seemed to move, and the trees whispered secrets only the wind could hear. The night settled heavily over the forest, its stillness pressing against the campers like an invisible weight. The fire burned low, its once lively flames reduced to glowing embers. Jake, Sarah, Nick, and Mia sat in a loose circle, their laughter now subdued as exhaustion from the day's hike took hold. Emily stared into the fire, her brow furrowed, still haunted by the stone slab and its strange carvings. "All right, I'm calling it a night," Sarah said, stretching and stifling a yawn. She picked up her flashlight and gestured toward her tent. "Don't stay up too late, you guys." "Yeah, I'm heading in too," Mia added, her camera slung over her shoulder as she carefully placed it in her bag. "Got enough pictures for the day." The group exchanged goodnights, and one by one, they retreated to their tents, the forest's oppressive quiet resuming. Emily stayed by the fire a little longer, unable to shake the unease coiling in her stomach. "Come on, Em," Nick said, noticing her distant expression. "It's just a rock. Stop overthinking it." "I hope you're right," she replied, her voice low. Jake smirked as he threw another stick into the dying fire. "You're acting like we uncovered some cursed treasure or something. It's probably just some old marker or ruins. Relax." Emily didn't respond. Instead, she gave a curt nod and made her way to her tent, zipping herself in and curling up in her sleeping bag. The night was unnervingly quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves breaking the stillness. But as Emily drifted off, a faint vibration seemed to pulse through the ground beneath her, subtle yet insistent, like a heartbeat deep within the earth. The first scream came just before dawn. Emily jolted awake, her heart pounding as she scrambled to unzip her tent. The forest, which had been eerily quiet, was now alive with frantic voices and the sound of snapping branches. She stumbled into the clearing to find Sarah, her face pale and tear-streaked, clutching her arm as though it had been burned. "Sarah, what happened?" Emily demanded, rushing to her side. It was something in the woods," Sarah stammered, her voice trembling. "I woke up, and I don't even know what I saw. It was moving under the ground like a shadow, and then it grabbed me." "Grabbed you?" Jake asked, his voice skeptical as he joined them, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Sarah held out her arm, revealing faint, finger-like impressions wrapped around her wrist, as if something had reached up from the earth and tried to pull her down. Jake's confident smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of concern. "Okay, that's weird. Are you sure it wasn't just a nightmare?" "It wasn't a nightmare," Sarah snapped, her voice rising. "I felt it. I heard it whispering." "Whispering?" Emily repeated, her stomach knotting. Sarah nodded, her eyes wide and wild. "It was saying things I couldn't understand, but it felt like it wanted me." The group exchanged uneasy glances. Even Nick, who had spent most of the trip complaining and cracking jokes, looked unsettled. "All right, let's not panic," Emily said, trying to take charge. "Maybe it was an animal or something. Let's just stick together today, okay? No wandering off." But as the day unfolded, the unease only grew. By midday, the forest seemed to have changed. The sunlight that had dappled the trees the previous day was now dim and filtered, as though the canopy had thickened overnight. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the once familiar trail they had followed seemed to twist and turn in unfamiliar ways. Mia lagged behind the group, her camera in hand as she took photos of the strange roots that seemed to protrude from the ground like skeletal fingers. She knelt to get a closer shot when she felt it, a faint vibration beneath her knees. Did anyone else feel that? She called out, her voice trembling. The group stopped and turned to look at her. Feel what? Emily asked. The ground, Mia said, standing slowly. It's moving. Jake knelt and pressed his palm to the dirt. For a moment there was nothing, but then a faint pulse rippled through the earth, subtle but unmistakable. Okay, that's creepy, Jake admitted, standing and brushing off his hands. Nick rolled his eyes. Probably just an underground spring or something. Let's keep moving. But Emily wasn't convinced. She couldn't ignore the way the forest seemed to close in around them, the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. By the time they returned to camp, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, golden rays across the clearing. But the beauty of the sunset was lost on the group, who sat in tense silence around the campfire, each of them haunted by their own unease. We need to leave tomorrow, Emily said firmly, breaking the silence. Leave? Nick scoffed. Over some creepy vibes and a couple of weird vibrations? Come on, Emily, don't be dramatic. It's not just that, she snapped. Something's wrong here. You all feel it. You just don't want to admit it. The group fell silent, and for a moment the only sound was the crackling of the fire. Then came the whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible over the fire's crackle. But as the group strained to listen, it grew louder, more distinct. It was a soft, sibilant voice, speaking a language none of them recognized. Did you hear that? Sarah whispered, her face pale. Yeah, Jake said, his voice barely audible. Emily stood, her eyes scanning the dark woods beyond the firelight. Who's out there? She called, her voice shaking. The whispering stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed against their ears like static. Then, from the darkness, came the sound of something slithering. It was faint at first, like the rustle of leaves in the wind, but it grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. The sound of something large moving just beyond the firelight. Everyone, get to your tents, Emily ordered, her voice tight with fear. The group scrambled to obey, their previous bravado replaced by raw terror. Emily stayed by the fire, clutching a flashlight as she tried to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. But the beam of light revealed nothing but trees and shadows. The slithering stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. But then, from deep within the forest, came a low, guttural growl that sent a chill down Emily's spine. She didn't wait to find out what it was. She bolted for her tent, zipping it shut and pressing her back against the fabric as she tried to steady her breathing. Outside, the forest was alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves, the snapping of branches, and the faint, haunting whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Emily clutched her flashlight like a lifeline, her mind racing as she tried to figure out what to do. But deep down, she knew one thing for certain. Whatever they had disturbed in this forest, it wasn't going to let them leave. The night dragged on like a living nightmare. The whispers continued, rising and falling like a sinister chant, accompanied by the eerie rustling and slithering just beyond the tents. Inside their shelters, the campers huddled together, too terrified to sleep. Emily clutched her flashlight in one hand and a small camping knife in the other, her knuckles white with tension. Outside, the whispers coalesced into a rhythmic chant, guttural and unearthly. It seemed to come from every direction, growing louder as though the forest itself was alive and closing in. Emily strained to catch the words, but the language was foreign, ancient, impossible to comprehend. And then came the vibration. It started as a faint hum beneath their sleeping bags, but soon it grew stronger, shaking the ground with a deep, resonant pulse. Emily's heart raced as she felt the tremors intensify, the earth beneath her seeming to breathe in slow, deliberate rhythms. From the neighboring tents came muffled voices. Emily, do you feel that? Sarah's voice quivered, barely audible over the growing din outside. Yeah, Emily whispered back. Stay inside. Don't move. But before Sarah could reply, a sharp scream tore through the night. "Mia!" Emily yelled, scrambling out of her tent, flashlight in hand. She stumbled toward Mia's tent, the beam of light slicing through the oppressive darkness. The zipper to Mia's tent hung open, and the interior was empty. Emily's stomach dropped as she turned toward the forest, the whispers now deafening, as though mocking her. "Mia!" she shouted, her voice cracking. The others emerged from their tents, their faces pale and panicked. "Where is she?" Nick demanded, spinning in circles as if expecting Mia to appear out of the darkness. "She's gone," Emily said, her voice hollow. Suddenly, the ground beneath them heaved, throwing them off balance. They hit the dirt hard, the tremors knocking the flashlight from Emily's hand. As she scrambled to grab it, she saw something horrific. A long, sinewy shape slithering just beneath the surface, moving with purpose toward the center of the camp. "Run!" Emily screamed, pulling Sarah to her feet. The group bolted into the woods, their breaths ragged as they sprinted through the underbrush. The chanting followed them, growing louder and more frantic, the voices overlapping in a cacophony of madness. The trees seemed to close in around them, the path disappearing beneath their feet. Emily led the group, her flashlight flickering as the batteries struggled to keep up. Sarah clung to her arm, her breathing shallow and rapid. Nick and Jake trailed behind, their panic evident in their frantic movements. "We can't just keep running!" Nick shouted, doubling over to catch his breath. "We don't even know where we're going! We can't stop!" Emily snapped. "Whatever that thing is, it's following us!" As if on cue, the forest floor rumbled again, and the slithering sound returned, louder this time. Jake turned, shining his flashlight toward the ground. What he saw froze him in place. The earth bulged unnaturally, like a wave rippling through soil, and then it split open. A grotesque worm-like appendage burst forth, its surface slick and glistening, covered in jagged, spiny ridges. It coiled and uncoiled with terrifying speed, lashing toward them. "Move!" Jake shouted, shoving Nick forward as the appendage struck the ground where he had been standing. The group ran harder, adrenaline pushing them beyond their limits. The whispers gave way to guttural roars, the creature's presence now undeniable. They burst into a clearing, their feet skidding to a halt as they took in the sight before them. It was the burial ground. The same ancient slab they had discovered earlier, now surrounded by glowing symbols etched into the dirt. The air was thick with the metallic stench of blood, and at the center of the slab lay Mia, her body unnaturally contorted. "Mia!" Sarah cried, rushing forward, but Emily grabbed her arm, holding her back. "She's alive!" Sarah protested, tears streaming down her face. "No, she's not," Emily said, her voice trembling. Mia's head turned slowly, her neck bending at an unnatural angle. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, were now black voids, leaking a viscous, inky fluid. She opened her mouth and the unearthly chant poured out, her voice merging with the cacophony surrounding them. "She's one of them," Jake whispered, his face pale. The ground beneath the slab began to crack, glowing red as if molten lava bubbled just beneath the surface. From the fissures emerged more of the grotesque appendages, writhing and twisting in an unholy dance. "We have to destroy it," Emily shouted, grabbing a large branch from the ground. "Destroy what?" Nick yelled, his voice filled with despair. "What even is this?" "The slab," Emily said. "It's the center of all this." With no other options, the group sprang into action. Emily and Jake rushed toward the slab, dodging the lashing appendages as best they could. Nick and Sarah distracted the creature, throwing rocks and debris at its writhing limbs. Emily swung the branch with all her strength, smashing it against the stone. The impact sent a shockwave through the ground, and the glowing symbols flickered. The creature let out a deafening roar, its appendages thrashing wildly. "Keep going!" Jake yelled, grabbing another branch and joining her. They struck the slab again and again, each blow weakening the glow. The chanting grew frantic, the voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of rage and desperation. Finally, with one last swing, the slab cracked down the middle. The glow disappeared, and the creature let out an ear-piercing shriek. The ground heaved violently, and the appendages began to retreat, sinking back into the earth. The forest fell silent. The group stood in the clearing, panting and covered in dirt. The burial ground was gone, reduced to a smoldering patch of earth. "What the hell just happened?" Nick asked, his voice trembling. Emily looked at the spot where the slab had been, her hands still shaking. "I don't know, but it's over." They turned to leave, their steps heavy with exhaustion. But as they walked, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was still watching them, its presence lingering in the shadows. As they reached the edge of the woods, the faint sound of whispers followed them, a chilling reminder that the hunger beneath the ground was never truly satisfied. Story number 6. The campfire crackled as the group of friends laughed and shared stories under the star-filled sky. It was their annual getaway, a cherished tradition where they escaped the grind of everyday life to reconnect with nature and each other. This year they had chosen a secluded forest by the edge of a pristine lake. The location was idyllic, far removed from the noise of civilization. There were 6 of them: Claire, the planner of the group; Jake, her easygoing boyfriend; Sarah, her childhood best friend; Mark, the jokester; Naomi, the free spirit; and Alex, the quiet one who always seemed lost in thought. They had spent the day hiking, swimming, and basking in the sun, and now they were unwinding with beers and roasted marshmallows. "I'm telling you," Mark said, his voice rising with excitement, "this place is haunted. I read about it online. Some guy in the 70s claimed he saw ghosts here." "Ghosts? Really?" Sarah rolled her eyes, unimpressed. "You'll believe anything, Mark." "It's true," he insisted, leaning closer to the fire for dramatic effect. "The guy said he saw figures in the trees watching him." "Figures in the trees?" Naomi teased, tossing her long hair over her shoulder. "Maybe they were just animals, genius." The group burst into laughter, but the jovial mood shifted when a faint rustling sound came from the shadows beyond the firelight. They all fell silent, staring into the darkness. "Probably just the wind," Claire said, her tone firm but not entirely convincing. "Or a ghost," Mark whispered, earning a smack on the arm from Sarah. Then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged. A man, tall and striking, with piercing eyes that seemed to reflect the flames of their fire. He carried a weathered backpack slung over one shoulder and had an air of effortless confidence. "Sorry to intrude," the man said, his voice smooth as silk. "I didn't mean to startle you." Claire stood, instinctively stepping in front of the group. "Who are you?" she asked cautiously. "My name's Adrian," he replied, flashing a disarming smile. "I'm hiking through the area and saw your fire. Thought I'd say hello." The group exchanged glances. Strangers were rare this far out in the woods, but Adrian didn't seem threatening. In fact, his charisma was almost magnetic. "Join us," Jake said, gesturing to the fire. "We've got plenty of drinks." Adrian hesitated, as if weighing the invitation, before nodding. "Don't mind if I do." As he settled into the circle, the group quickly warmed to him. He had a knack for storytelling, weaving tales of his travels and adventures with such vivid detail that everyone was captivated. Even Alex, who rarely engaged in group conversations, found himself leaning forward, hanging on Adrian's every word. "You're quite the storyteller," Naomi said, her eyes sparkling as she handed Adrian a beer. "Thank you," Adrian replied, his gaze lingering on her for just a moment too long. It's always nice to have an audience. The night wore on, and the group's initial wariness faded. Adrian seemed like the perfect guest, charming, funny, and utterly engaging. But as the fire burned low and the forest grew quieter, Claire couldn't shake a gnawing sense of unease. Something about Adrian felt off. The group eventually turned in for the night, retreating to their tents. Claire shared one with Jake, but she lay awake long after he started snoring. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Adrian. His arrival had been too convenient, too perfectly timed. And those stories he told, how did he remember every detail so vividly? She was on the verge of drifting off when she heard it. A faint whisper, like someone speaking just outside the tent. Her eyes snapped open and her heart began to race. Carefully, she nudged Jake. "Jake," she whispered, "wake up." "What is it?" he mumbled, half asleep. "I heard something," she said, her voice trembling. "Outside." Jake groaned but sat up, rubbing his eyes. "It's probably just an animal." "No," Claire insisted. "It sounded like a voice." Reluctantly, Jake grabbed a flashlight and unzipped the tent. He stepped outside, sweeping the beam of light around the campsite. Claire followed, her stomach in knots. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim glow over the clearing. The other tents were zipped shut, and the forest was eerily silent. There was no sign of Adrian. "See? Nothing," Jake said, turning back toward the tent. But Claire wasn't convinced. As she scanned the area, her gaze fell on something odd. Footprints in the dirt, leading away from the campsite. They were too large to belong to any of her friends, and they were headed toward the lake. "Jake, look," she said, pointing. He frowned. "Maybe Adrian went for a walk." "In the middle of the night?" Claire asked, her unease growing. Jake shrugged. "He's a grown man. Let's go back to bed." Reluctantly, Claire followed him into the tent. But she couldn't sleep. The whispers had stopped, but the sense of being watched lingered, crawling over her skin like 1,000 tiny insects. The next morning, Adrian was back, sitting by the fire as if he'd been there all night. He greeted the group with his usual charm, but Claire noticed he avoided her gaze, and when she looked closely, she saw something that sent a chill down her spine, a smear of dirt on his hands, as if he'd been digging. As the day wore on, strange things began to happen. Naomi, who had been so outgoing and carefree, started acting withdrawn, her eyes distant. Mark, the group's joker, stopped laughing, his face pale and drawn. Even Jake seemed different, quieter, more serious. Claire tried to confront Adrian, but every time she approached him, he managed to deflect her questions with a joke or a story. It was as if he could sense her suspicions and was determined to keep her off balance. That night, the whispers returned. This time they were louder, more insistent, and they seemed to be coming from all directions. Claire lay frozen in her sleeping bag, her heart pounding. Then, she heard the zipper of her tent being pulled. She bolted upright, grabbing the flashlight. But when she shone it toward the opening, no one was there. Trembling, she stepped outside and found herself face to face with Adrian. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his smile as unsettling as it was beautiful. "What are you doing?" Claire demanded, her voice shaking. "Just enjoying the night," he replied. "It's so peaceful out here." Claire took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to run. "Who are you, really?" Adrian's smile widened, and for the first time she saw something monstrous in his eyes, a darkness that seemed to pulse and writhe like a living thing. "I told you," he said, his voice dropping to a low, chilling tone. "I'm just a traveler, but I take only what's freely offered." Before Claire could respond, Naomi appeared, her expression blank and her movements stiff, like a puppet on strings. She walked straight past Claire and into Adrian's arms. "No!" Claire shouted, but it was too late. Adrian leaned in, his lips brushing Naomi's ear as he whispered something Claire couldn't hear. Naomi's eyes widened in terror, and then her body went limp, collapsing to the ground. "Stop this!" Claire screamed, grabbing a branch from the ground and swinging it at Adrian. But he caught it effortlessly, his strength inhuman. You're all so eager, he said, his tone almost pitying. You invite me in, you give me your trust, and then you wonder why it ends this way. Claire turned and ran, tears streaming down her face. She didn't stop until she reached the lake, where the moonlight reflected off the still water like shards of broken glass. Behind her, she heard footsteps, and Adrian's voice, smooth and seductive. You can't escape, Claire. You've already let me in. But Claire wasn't ready to give up. Summoning every ounce of courage, she turned to face him, determined to fight. She would protect her friends, no matter the cost. As Adrian closed the distance between them, his true form began to emerge, his skin shimmering like black glass, his eyes glowing with an unholy light. But Claire stood her ground, refusing to let him win. You may have taken them, she said, her voice steady despite her fear. But you won't take me. Adrian tilted his head, intrigued. We'll see about that. Claire stood by the lake, her back against the water's edge, heart pounding in her chest as Adrian's form loomed closer, his presence suffocating and overwhelming. The night air grew cold as the very trees seemed to hold their breath, watching. His steps were slow but deliberate, his gaze fixed on her as though she were the only thing that mattered in the world. You're not like the others, Adrian said, his voice a soft, melodic whisper that seemed to reverberate in Claire's very bones. Most would have run away by now, but you stay. Claire's mind raced. She wanted to run, needed to, but something inside her refused to yield. I'm not afraid of you, she said, her voice hoarse, though her body trembled with fear. Adrian's eyes flickered with amusement, the corners of his lips curling up in a slow, seductive smile. Oh, but you should be. Fear is a beautiful thing. It makes people so much more pliable. He took another step toward her, and this time Claire did not step back. She couldn't. She knew that the moment she turned and ran, he would have her. Mind, body, and soul. She needed to confront this creature, this predator, face to face. What are you? She demanded, her eyes narrowing, the branch she had grabbed earlier still clutched tightly in her hand. Why are you doing this? Adrian's gaze softened, a false tenderness creeping into his expression, as if he were trying to comfort her. You really don't understand, do you, Claire? He said, almost regretfully. I am nothing but a reflection of what you desire. I am the embodiment of the things you long for most. He stepped closer, his eyes flickering with a strange light, a dangerous gleam. Claire instinctively tightened her grip on the branch, her knuckles turning white. That's a lie, she spat. You're not a reflection. You're something worse. You're using us, feeding off of our weaknesses, our fears. Adrian's smile never faltered. And you think that makes me different from you? We all desire, Claire. We all hunger. It's human nature. Claire swallowed hard, the taste of fear mingling with a bitter rage that burned in her chest. She had to break free of this, had to stop him from ensnaring her like the others. But what could she do? He had already shown his power, his ability to manipulate the desires of those around him. You don't control me, she said, her voice stronger now, though she could feel the weight of her own doubts creeping in. You can't. You're just a man. No, not even that. You're a parasite. Adrian paused, his expression flickering, his eyes narrowing as he regarded her with something akin to amusement? A parasite? He chuckled, a low, menacing sound that echoed through the trees. Oh, Claire, you're just like the others, always thinking you can control what desires you give into. But in the end, it is your desires that will control you. Without warning, he lunged forward, too fast for her to react, his hand wrapped around her wrist, yanking her toward him with unnatural strength. Claire gasped, her breath caught in her throat as her heart pounded in her chest. She fought back, pulling against his grip, but it was like trying to break free from a vice. You think you can resist me? Adrian whispered, his face inches from hers. You can't. You've already let me in, Claire. I've been inside you longer than you realize. Claire felt a sudden, inexplicable surge of heat coursing through her body. It wasn't just physical warmth. It was as though something deep inside her, something primal, was awakening. Her mind screamed for her to fight, but her body betrayed her, shivering with an unfamiliar desire. It was as if the very air around her had thickened, intoxicating her senses. No, she whispered, shaking her head in denial. You can't control me. Adrian's fingers trailed down her arm, his touch soft yet electrifying. I don't need to control you, Claire. I only need you to embrace what's always been there. The world around her seemed to blur as his voice became a soft, seductive hum, lulling her into a dazed state. She fought to hold on to herself, to her sanity, but Adrian's presence was all-consuming, his power seeping into her mind like a drug. Stop, she begged, her voice a mere whisper. Please. Adrian tilted his head, his gaze darkening with a mixture of pity and amusement. Please. It's too late for that. You've already given me your trust, your desires. You've already let me into your heart. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. It was true. She had let her guard down, had welcomed him into her life with open arms. But now, in the cold light of reality, she understood the full extent of what he was doing. You don't have to do this, she whispered, her voice breaking. Of course I do, Adrian murmured, his lips brushing against her ear. I am what you want, Claire, and soon you'll want nothing else. His lips were on hers before she could react, a kiss that was soft at first, gentle, but then deepened with an intensity that left her breathless. It wasn't just passion. It was as if he was stealing something from her, feeding on her very essence. Suddenly, Claire's mind snapped back to reality, and she shoved him away with all the strength she could muster. She stumbled back, her heart pounding, her body still humming with a foreign heat. Get away from me, she gasped, her chest heaving. Adrian's eyes darkened with disappointment. You fight it, but you're only delaying the inevitable, he said softly. I am your deepest desire, and when you're ready, you'll come to me. With those final words, Adrian turned and walked back toward the campsite, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. Claire stood frozen, her mind racing, her heart in turmoil. She was shaken to her core, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't let him win. Not now. Not ever. Claire stumbled back to the campsite, her hands trembling, her heart still racing from the encounter. The air around her seemed thick, heavy with a sense of dread that she couldn't shake. She had felt it, Adrian's pull, the magnetic force of his dark influence. But she had fought it. Barely. When she reached the fire pit, her friends were already gathered, sitting silently around the dying embers. Jake, Naomi, Sarah, Mark, and Alex. They all looked up as she approached, their faces pale and drawn. It was as if they had been waiting for something, and now that Claire had returned, it felt like the moment had passed. Claire's mind raced as she tried to make sense of everything. She had to warn them. They needed to leave. But when she looked into their eyes, she realized something was wrong, something deep and unsettling. They were all staring at her, but not in concern. There was something else in their gazes, something dark, hungry. No, Claire whispered. No, not you too. Adrian's words echoed in her mind. You've already let me in, Claire. And she understood now. It wasn't just her. He had already ensnared them all. One by one, Adrian had worked his way into their hearts, their desires. He had turned them into puppets, feeding off their weaknesses and twisting them to his will. Claire took a step back, her legs shaking beneath her. Stay away from me, she pleaded, her voice trembling with fear. But it was too late. As she watched in horror, the faces of her friends seemed to shift, their expressions melting into something unrecognizable. Their eyes glowed with a strange, unholy light, and in the depths of their gazes, she could see it. The darkness that Adrian had implanted in them, the insatiable hunger. She was surrounded. There was nowhere to run, no escape. All she could do was stand there, trapped in the nightmare that Adrian had woven. And as the last remnants of her resistance crumbled, she knew one thing. She had lost. The seduction was complete. When the fire dies down and the night falls silent, remember, the woods have secrets that were never meant to be found. What you've just heard were stories of survival or gruesome failure in the face of unimaginable terror. Are you brave enough to step into the wilderness after this, or will you let these nightmares stay with you forever? Don't forget to share your own terrifying encounters in the comments. Until next time, stay safe and stay in the light.